Dawn breaks over the Areopagus. Athens is under siege. Fresh graves line the path toward the pinnacles cut into the earth for those not yet fallen but already counted. Before the Athenian ranks stands a single Amazon warrior, armor dusted from campaign. She is Antiope, queen of the Amazons, wife of Theseus. She carries two identities at once. In this war, both demand her death. The war did not arrive at the borders of Athens. It detonated inside the city's own world. The Attic War unfolded not on distant plains or contested colonies, but within sight of the Acropolis, against the foundations of civic life itself. For a Greek polis built on the assumption that war belonged beyond its walls, this was an inversion without precedent. Athens was forced to confront an enemy that did not raid and withdraw, but advanced with the intention to stay surround and decide the city's future by force. Across the Aegean, the Amazons mobilized. They crossed the sea in organized formations, not as scattered raiders, but as an army with command structure, supply, discipline, and political purpose. Ancient sources describe no male auxiliaries, no conscripted allies. This was a force composed entirely of women trained for war, moving as a collective with shared command and singular intent. Their landing points cut across Attica. Their movement pressed inward toward the symbolic core of Athenian authority. The shock was immediate. Athens had fought Persians, Cretans, and rival Greek states. It had never faced a siege mounted by a foreign power that rejected its most basic social assumptions. The Amazon army did not negotiate tribute. It did not recognize Athenian marriage bonds as binding. It did not acknowledge male monopoly over command. Its presence alone destabilized the ideological ground on which the city stood. The response could not be delayed. To hesitate was to concede legitimacy. The assembly understood the stakes without articulation. If the Amazons held ground within Attica, the city's claim to order, hierarchy, and continuity collapsed. Athens mobilized not for honor, not for expansion, but for survival. Hoplites were assembled. Citizen levies called sanctuaries fortified. The city prepared to defend itself against an enemy whose very existence challenged its self-definition. What followed was not a single clash, but a sustained confrontation. Amazon forces entrenched themselves at key elevations and routes controlling access between the hills and the civic center. Supply lines tightened. Movement within Attica became contested. The war pressed into daily life. Farms were abandoned. Processions halted. Political ritual yielded to military necessity. Athens experienced siege conditions imposed not by distance but by proximity. This conflict would later be remembered as Amazonomachy, but at the time it had no mythic framing. It was immediate, unresolved, and deeply unsettling. The presence of Antiope within Athens sharpened the tension. Her existence made the war intelligible and intolerable at once. She was proof that Amazon power could cross into Greek life and persist. As long as she lived within the city, the conflict could not be reduced to an external threat. The Athenians did not yet know how the war would end. They did not know which stories would survive or which names would be erased. What they understood was simpler. The Amazons were not an episode. They were not a symbol. They were an army encamped against the city, and their defeat or endurance would define how Athens remembered itself. This is her story. The Attic War cannot be understood without the world that produced it. This was the century before Persia, before the language of East and West hardened into imperial opposition. Athens was still assembling itself. Politically, socially, ideologically. Kingship had been broken, but democracy was not yet secure. Power circulated through lineage, landholding, and male citizenship, bound together by emerging laws that defined who could rule, who could speak, and who could belong. Within this fragile construction, gender was not symbolic. It was structural. Political authority was male. Military command was male. Lineage passed through men. Women anchored households but did not govern them. This arrangement was presented not as choice, but as nature. Stability depended on its repetition. The Amazons represented a direct inversion of that order. In Greek accounts, they ruled themselves. Women commanded armies, owned territory, and decided succession. Men, when present at all, occupied peripheral or functional roles. Marriage was regulated or rejected. Reproduction served the polity, not the household. War was not an extension of male honor but a civic obligation executed by women. This was not merely foreign, it was threatening in form. The Amazon system suggested that hierarchy could be reorganized without collapse, that political competence was not gendered, that warfare did not require patriarchy to function. For a society still arguing its own foundations into existence, this alternative could not be allowed legitimacy. Greek thought resolved this problem by relocation. Amazons were placed at the edges of the known world, along the Black Sea beyond Thrace, near the shifting boundaries of Asia. Distance made the inversion tolerable. So long as Amazon power remained far away, it could be contained as anomaly. The Attic War broke that containment. Amazon forces crossed into Greece proper and established themselves within Attica itself. The ideological other was no longer distant. It occupied hills, roads, and sanctuaries tied to Athenian identity. The conflict was therefore narrated not only as a military defense, but as a defense of civilization. In this framing, Athens did not fight a rival polity. It fought disorder. Amazon society became shorthand for excess, inversion, and threat. The war was recast as necessary, preemptive, and righteous. Athens defended law against chaos, marriage against deviance, and male governance against its negation. This transformation shaped how the conflict was remembered. Later retellings stripped the war of its immediacy and recoded it as myth. The Amazons became symbols rather than actors. Their political structure dissolved into caricature. Their motives narrowed to rage or vengeance. The defense of Athens became inevitable rather than contingent. What disappeared in this process was the reality that the Attic War was not fought against fantasy. It was fought against an organized society whose existence destabilized Greek claims about nature and order. Antiope's presence within Athens made that instability impossible to ignore. By the time Persian armies would later cross into Greece, Athens already possessed a narrative template. Foreign invasion could be framed as moral opposition. Defense could be elevated into destiny. The Amazons provided the prototype. The Attic War thus survived not as history but as justification. Antiope entered this world already marked by contradiction. Greek tradition names her the daughter of Ares and Otrera, born into a ruling line where authority was not inherited through men but earned through command. She stood among sisters whose names carried the same weight: Hippolyta, Penthesilea. Women remembered not as consorts but as sovereigns and war leaders. In Amazon society, lineage mattered only insofar as it produced competence. Power was not symbolic. It was exercised. She was raised within a system designed for permanence, through force. Amazon rule depended on continuous readiness for war, territorial defense, and expansion when necessary. Girls were trained from early childhood not for domestic roles but for combat and leadership. Social bonds were collective rather than marital. Loyalty was owed first to the polity, then to the individual. Within this structure, Antiope became a queen not through ceremony but through recognition. Ancient sources do not record a coronation. They record obedience. She commanded expeditions. She led campaigns. Her authority was visible in action, not announced in title. Yet the same system that elevated her imposed absolute limits. Amazon law did not permit romantic attachment to override civic duty. Leaving the polity for personal allegiance was treated as betrayal. Love, as understood by Greek poets, had no legal standing. Survival of the collective outweighed continuity of the self. Antiope's fate diverged precisely at this boundary. Unlike Penthesilea, who would later die in open battle before Troy, Antiope did not fall as a warrior defending Amazon territory. Her story turned not on defeat but on survival beyond her society's rules. She crossed from Themyscira into Athens and remained alive within an enemy order. This was an inversion, more destabilizing than death. A fallen Amazon could be contained as noble adversary. A living one embedded within Athens as queen could not. Antiope's presence collapsed distance. She embodied a system Athens defined itself against, now housed within its royal line. Greek sources struggled to reconcile this contradiction. Some reduced her role to victim carried off by Theseus against her will. Others framed her departure as choice, love, or persuasion. The variation itself reveals the problem. Antiope's agency threatened both narratives. If abducted, she remained Amazon but powerless. If willing, she invalidated the absoluteness of Amazon law. What remains consistent is the outcome. Antiope did not return. She lived as Hoang-ho, Athens' mother to an heir, occupying a role structurally denied to her origin and ideologically suspect to her new city. She became a woman who could not be placed without distortion. Her survival required reinterpretation. Greek memory would later flatten her complexity into function: cause of war, symbol of betrayal, or tragic exception. But at the center of every version stands the same fact. Antiope crossed an absolute boundary and lived. That act, more than any battle, made war inevitable. From the beginning, Amazon education was not preparatory. It was operative. Children were trained for war, not as future possibility, but as present condition. Antiope's earliest years unfolded within a regime where physical endurance, coordination, and command awareness were cultivated simultaneously. Hunting was not sport. It was logistics, tracking, and kill discipline. Horsemanship was not mobility alone, but formation control at speed. Weapons training began before adolescence, embedded into daily routine rather than separated as instruction. As a child, Antiope learned to move within units. Individual prowess mattered only insofar as it reinforced collective action. Formation, integrity, signal recognition, and reaction under pressure defined advancement. Injury was expected. Withdrawal was not. Authority emerged early, as those who maintained cohesion were deferred to without formal rank. Youth marked transition into expeditionary warfare. Antiope accompanied senior queens on campaigns beyond core territory, observing siege preparation, supply movement, and terrain exploitation. These were not raids for prestige. They were calculated operations designed to expand, influence, secure resources, or neutralize threats. Command was rotational, contingent on competence demonstrated in action. Failure removed authority immediately. Within this system, Antiope distinguished herself not through aggression but through control. Sources emphasize her steadiness in advance, and withdrawal her capacity to maintain order under disruption. She was not described as reckless. She was described as feared. That fear was not personal. It was institutional. Her presence stabilized units. Her absence was noted. By maturity, Antiope functioned as a living symbol of Amazon sovereignty. She did not rule from distance. She rode at the front. Her armor marked rank without ornament. Her command relied on recognition rather than enforcement. Orders were followed because disobedience carried collective cost. This competence carried consequence. To Athens, she represented an enemy leader whose capabilities rivaled their own generals. To the Amazons, she embodied continuity of a system under constant external pressure. Her authority validated the Amazon model as viable, resilient, and exportable. Fear followed strength. Antiope's existence disrupted Greek assumptions about who could lead armies and sustain rule. She was not an exception produced by chaos. She was the outcome of design. Her power was cultivated, deliberately maintained through discipline, and reproduced through structure. This made her intolerable to myth. Legends require singularity. Antiope was systemic. She demonstrated that Amazon rule was not anomalous, but repeatable. That realization undercut narratives of natural hierarchy. By the time Antiope encountered Athens, she was not discovering power. She carried it with her. Her training had already rendered her incompatible with both submission and invisibility. The war would not make her dangerous. It would reveal that she already was. The meeting between Antiope and Theseus resists a single account because no version resolves its implications. Greek sources divide sharply. Some describe abduction, a display of heroic force in which the Amazon queen is siphoned carried from her territory. Others suggest deception, a negotiated encounter that concealed intent until withdrawal was impossible. A smaller tradition allows for consent, even alliance framed as mutual recognition between equals. The disagreement itself is the historical signal. Antiope's agency could not be fixed without destabilizing one side or the other. If she was taken by force, then Amazon power was penetrable and Athens reaffirmed dominance. If she departed willingly, then Amazon law was not absolute, and Athens gained legitimacy through attraction rather than conquest. Both outcomes served Greek narrative needs. Neither fully accounts for what followed. What is consistent is the decision. Antiope left Themyscira and crossed into Attica. She did not escape. She did not return. She remained in Athens and entered the royal household of Theseus. This was not temporary asylum. It was relocation with permanence. For Amazon society, this act could only be interpreted one way. Departure without sanction constituted betrayal. The system could absorb death. It could not absorb defection. Antiope's survival outside the polity undermined the principle that loyalty was enforced by necessity rather than belief. Her choice suggested that Amazon identity could be abandoned without immediate collapse. For Athens, her arrival created a contradiction. Antiope was neither captive nor guest in any stable sense. As wife, she was integrated into the ruling line. As Amazon, she remained foreign, armed with a legitimacy not derived from male lineage. Athens accepted her presence but did not resolve her status. She was tolerated as exception, not absorbed as precedent. The ambiguity served immediate political needs. Theseus gained a powerful symbol, a former enemy queen bound to his household. Antiope gained protection and position within a system that did not fully trust her. Both sides postponed the reckoning. The Amazons did not. Antiope's departure triggered mobilization. Queens who had fought beside her now assembled against her decision. The cause was not personal grievance, but structural threat. If a queen could leave and live, the system's coercive logic weakened. War was not revenge. It was correction. From this point, conflict became inevitable, regardless of motive. Even if Antiope had been abducted, the result was identical. Amazon honor and cohesion required response. Even if Athens claimed legitimacy through marriage, the presence of Amazon forces within Attica nullified that claim. The war no longer hinged on interpretation. It advanced through necessity. Antiope stood at the center of this escalation without commanding it. Her movement triggered forces larger than intent. She had crossed a boundary that both societies enforced differently but defended equally. By leaving Themyscira, Antiope did not choose peace. She removed the option of it. What followed would no longer be about her will, but about containment. The conflict accelerated in cycles, each reinforcing the next. Antiope's position in Athens marked the first rupture. As queen, she bore a son who became Theseus's heir, binding Amazon blood to the Athenian line of succession. This was not symbolic union. It carried legal and political weight. The child embodied continuity that could not be reversed without consequence. For Athens, the lineage was secured. For the Amazons, it was confirmation that Antiope's departure was permanent. The response was immediate and organized. Amazon leaders convened, drawing forces from across their territories and allied regions. This was not a single march, but a coalition movement. Units gathered along established routes, crossing the Bosphorus and moving through Thrace toward Greece. The scale exceeded earlier expeditions. The objective was no longer retrieval. It was confrontation. The third cycle was siege. Amazon forces established positions around Athens and across Attica, controlling approaches and supply corridors. Ancient accounts speak of 4 months of sustained pressure. Whether literal or emblematic, the duration signals endurance. This was not a raid. It was an attempt to impose decision through attrition. The city's walls were tested. Its hinterland was stripped of stability. Civic life contracted under military necessity. At this stage, the conflict ceased to revolve around Antiope as individual. Her role had expanded beyond personal allegiance. She had become the fault line between 2 systems of rule. The Amazons advanced not simply to punish betrayal, but to negate the possibility that an alternative order could coexist within Athens. Athens resisted not merely invasion, but the implication that its social hierarchy could be breached and survive. Every cycle reduced options. Antiope's motherhood tied her fate to Athens irrevocably. Amazon mobilization erased any claim of private dispute. Prolonged siege forced Athens to define the war publicly as existential. Negotiation disappeared from the record not because it failed, but because it became unthinkable. This escalation transformed the meaning of the war. It was no longer a contest over a person or a marriage. It became a struggle between incompatible structures. One system permitted no exit. The other permitted entry, but not equality. Antiope existed in the narrowing space between them. Her presence inside Athens did not stabilize the conflict. It intensified it. Each side now fought not only for territory but for the integrity of its rules. To yield was to admit that its order could be violated without collapse. By the time the siege tightened, resolution required more than victory. It required elimination of ambiguity. Antiope, alive and positioned between worlds, represented unresolved contradiction. The war had grown beyond its cause. It now demanded an ending that could be remembered. Leadership of the Amazon force passed to figures whose authority was uncontested. Some traditions name Orithyia, others Hippolyta, but the role is consistent. A ruling queen assumed command and converted grievance into formal war. This was not personal vengeance. It was a ritualized assertion of sovereignty. The Amazons advanced under recognized leadership, carrying the legitimacy of their system into open confrontation. Before battle, Athens enacted its own rites. Theseus ordered sacrifices to Phobos, the embodiment of fear, acknowledging that morale would decide what walls could not. The act was not superstition. It was discipline. Fear was named, contained, and redirected toward cohesion. The city prepared itself for a fight it could not retreat from. The decisive clashes unfolded across the heights that defined Athenian power. The Areopagus and the Pnyx became contested ground, not symbolic backdrops, but operational objectives. Control of these elevations meant command over movement, assembly, and visibility. Fighting there collapsed the distinction between civic and military space. Politics and violence occupied the same stone. Amazon formations pressed hard, exploiting speed and coordination. Their tactics favored envelopment and disruption rather than direct hoplite collision. Athenian forces responded with density and defense, holding ground through massed shields and controlled advance. Neither side achieved decisive breakthrough. Losses mounted without resolution. The struggle ended without collapse. Athens did not fall. Its institutions remained intact, but the victory was incomplete. Amazon forces withdrew in order, not in rout. Their retreat preserved cohesion and honor, denying Athens the clarity of triumph. This ambiguity mattered. A clean victory would have allowed closure. Instead, the war concluded with survival rather than dominance. Athens endured, but it did not erase its adversary. The Amazons remained undefeated in principle, if not in position. In later memory, this complexity was simplified. The battle was framed as Athenian success, the threat contained, order restored. Yet the reality was less stable. The city had been tested at its core and had not imposed absolute resolution. The presence of Antiope ensured that outcome could never be purely military. The war ended on the field, but its consequences remained inside Athens itself. The confrontation had proven that the city could withstand assault. It had not proven that it could absorb contradiction. Becoming the wife of Theseus did not end Antiope's involvement in the war. It repositioned it. Marriage placed her within the Athenian order, but it did not neutralize her origins or her capacity for action. As the conflict persisted, neutrality ceased to exist. Antiope was no longer a bridge between sides. She was a liability to both. For Athens, her presence was conditional. She was valued insofar as she reinforced stability through lineage alliance and symbolic submission to the polis. But she remained foreign, armed and trained in a system Athens defined as hostile. Trust extended only as far as usefulness. Any sign of divided loyalty threatened to unravel her protection. For the Amazons, the calculation was harsher. Antiope's survival within Athens, especially after the siege, represented a failure of enforcement. She had crossed the boundary and remained alive. That alone challenged the absoluteness of Amazon law. Her continued existence implied that defection did not guarantee annihilation. To preserve coherence, she had to be removed. The war thus pivoted. What began as confrontation between armies narrowed into a question of allegiance embodied in a single figure. Antiope could no longer stand outside the conflict. Silence would be interpreted as complicity by one side and betrayal by the other. Her decision was not recorded as debate or proclamation. It appeared in action. Antiope took up arms in defense of Athens. She did not command Amazon units. She did not attempt mediation. She fought alongside Athenian forces, accepting the role of protector rather than ruler. This choice carried immediate consequence. By fighting for Athens, Antiope converted suspicion into certainty. The Amazons no longer faced ambiguity. The queen who had left now actively opposed them. The logic of the system reasserted itself. Elimination became obligation. Athens in turn gained clarity without comfort. Antiope's loyalty was proven through risk, not rhetoric. Yet her participation exposed the city to internal contradiction. A foreign queen defending Athens against her own people destabilized claims of moral coherence. Victory achieved through her strength risked validating the system Athens rejected. Still, necessity overruled discomfort. Antiope's skill was deployed where pressure was greatest. She reinforced faltering lines and shielded retreat. Her presence stiffened resistance, but it also drew attention. Amazon forces identified her position and adapted accordingly. The war had entered its terminal phase. Structures narrowed. Options closed. Antiope's choice did not end the conflict. It sharpened it. From this point forward, her fate was no longer uncertain. It was targeted. The fighting spread across the civic terrain of Athens, collapsing boundaries between sanctuary training ground and battlefield. Engagements flared near the Lyceum, where young citizens once trained in discipline and rhetoric, now repurposed for formation and defense. Along the slopes of Ardettus, movement became fragmented units, breaking and reforming under pressure. The ground favored neither side. Control shifted by hour, not by day. Within this chaos, Antiope emerged as a stabilizing force. She did not seek prominence. She was placed where collapse threatened. When Amazon formations pressed against weakened Athenian lines, she moved forward not to strike first but to absorb impact. Her tactics favored interception. She positioned herself between advancing Amazon units and exposed Athenian soldiers, forcing engagement on her terms. Accounts describe moments where her presence alone altered momentum. Soldiers held position longer. Retreats slowed into order. Antiope used her familiarity with Amazon movement to anticipate feints and encirclements. She did not counter with symmetry. She disrupted timing. Attacks meant to overwhelm instead met resistance that delayed and redirected. This was leadership under constraint. Antiope commanded without formal authority, issuing signals rather than orders, relying on recognition earned through action. Athenian soldiers followed, not because of allegiance, but because survival aligned with her judgment. In these moments, the contradiction of her identity sharpened. She defended Athens using methods learned from those attacking it. The most cited episode occurs near the approaches to the Pnyx. Amazon forces surged through a narrow ascent, exploiting terrain that limited hoplite density. Athenian resistance began to buckle. Antiope advanced into the breach, drawing Amazon focus toward herself. She absorbed the initial assault, creating space for the line to reform behind her. The maneuver succeeded, but it fixed her position unmistakably. From that point, there was no ambiguity. Antiope was no longer merely present. She was acting decisively against Amazon objectives. Her choice became visible to all sides, irreversible in public. For the Amazons, this confirmed the necessity of her death. The queen who once embodied their order now used that same discipline to negate it. The response was not emotional. It was operational. Targeting tightened. Pressure concentrated. For Athens, the cost became clear. Antiope's defense preserved the line, but it also ensured that the conflict would claim her. Protection could not be extended without undermining the very structure she fought to defend. The city accepted her service without guaranteeing her survival. As fighting continued, Antiope remained forward. She did not withdraw when lines stabilized. She did not seek cover once objectives were secured. Her actions suggested understanding. Survival beyond this point offered no resolution. Only commitment did. The battlefield narrowed around her. Amazon units adjusted formation not to break Athens but to isolate the figure at its center. Antiope's strength had closed one path to defeat. It had opened another. From here, the war no longer asked who would hold the city. It asked who would be removed so that the city could endure. By the final phase of the conflict, Antiope no longer belonged to either order. For the Amazons, she had crossed from deviation into negation. A queen who fought against her own polity could not be reclaimed, forgiven, or ignored. Her death was required not as punishment, but as repair. The system demanded closure. For Athens, her position was equally unstable. Antiope had proven loyalty through action, yet her existence exposed the limits of Athenian inclusion. She fought for the city, but she did not fit within its rules. She was neither citizen nor subordinate, neither captive nor equal. Her presence could be tolerated only in crisis. Peace would render her indefensible. This dual threat narrowed her future to a single outcome. Antiope continued to fight without retreat, fully aware that withdrawal would not restore balance. Survival would prolong contradiction. Death would resolve it. Ancient sources differ on the precise moment, but they agree on the direction. Antiope fell not in isolation, but amid combat struck during engagement. Some accounts attribute the blow to an Amazon spear, others to an arrow loosed by one of her former sisters. The detail varies. The meaning does not. She was killed by the system she had left while defending the one that could not fully accept her. Her death did not halt the fighting immediately. Battles continued in fragmented engagements as news spread unevenly. But strategically, the conflict shifted. The Amazons had achieved the elimination required for internal coherence. Athens had lost the figure that embodied unresolved tension. The war's emotional and ideological center collapsed. For the Amazons, Antiope's death restored order. The breach was sealed. No living queen remained outside the polity as counterexample. Withdrawal could proceed without further threat to legitimacy. Their system endured intact. For Athens, the outcome was more complex. Antiope's sacrifice could be honored only selectively. Public acknowledgement risked elevating a foreign woman who had exercised authority outside male lineage. Silence was safer. Commemoration shifted from individual to collective victory. Her role was absorbed into the abstraction of Amazonomachy. Antiope died without reconciliation. She was not reclaimed by her people nor fully claimed by her city. Her end resolved the immediate conflict but exposed the cost of resolution itself. Both systems preserved their integrity by removing the figure who challenged their boundaries. Later retellings softened this conclusion. Some recast her death as tragic inevitability. Others displaced responsibility, making her a victim of fate rather than structure. But the underlying logic remains visible. Antiope did not fall because she was weak or indecisive. She fell because she refused erasure without action. Her death marked the limit of integration. It demonstrated that power exercised by a woman outside prescribed roles could be used, feared, and discarded, but not sustained. The war ended soon after, not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Athens survived. The Amazons withdrew. Order was restored on both sides. What could not be restored was Antiope. Her absence allowed memory to simplify the war. Without her, Amazonomachy could be retold as clean opposition rather than internal fracture. The contradiction she embodied was removed from the record. That removal was not accidental. It was necessary for the story Athens would tell next. Antiope's death did not conclude her presence in Athenian memory. It displaced it. With the war over, the city moved quickly to restore continuity. Theseus remarried. Phaedra entered the royal household, bringing with her legitimacy unburdened by contradiction. The line of succession stabilized. Public life resumed its rituals. Antiope's name receded from official narration, replaced by order. Yet the story did not end cleanly. Alternative traditions surfaced at the margins. In some versions, Antiope did not fall during the battle itself. Instead, she survived long enough to become a threat once more, this time not on the battlefield but at the threshold of domestic order. These accounts describe her attacking the wedding of Theseus and Phaedra, leading Amazon warriors into the heart of civic ceremony. Whether this assault is literal or symbolic, its function is clear. Antiope reappears as disruption at the moment Athens attempts closure. The contradiction is instructive. In one version, Antiope dies loyal to Athens, defending its soldiers, until she is cut down by her own people. In the other, she survives long enough to violate its most sacred institution, marriage, turning celebration into renewed conflict. The outcomes differ. The result does not. In every telling, Antiope must be removed. Her loyalty does not save her. Her resistance does not save her. Compliance leads to death. Defiance leads to eradication. The narrative permits no version in which Antiope persists beyond the point where she challenges structure. The system closes around her regardless of her choice. This is not moral judgment. It is structural resolution. Antiope occupies an impossible position. A woman who exercised sovereign power, crossed systems, and acted decisively within both. Such a figure cannot be reconciled with a political order that defines legitimacy through exclusion. She cannot be honored without consequence. She cannot be remembered without risk. The shadow of her story remains precisely because it is unresolved. Athens preserves the war but dissolves the woman. Amazonamaki survives as motif on temples, pottery, and civic monuments, while Antiope dissolves into interchangeable figures, sometimes Hippolyta, sometimes Orithyia, sometimes unnamed. The conflict becomes collective. The cost becomes abstract. What is erased is specificity. Antiope's choices, her competence, her refusal to disappear quietly, these are incompatible with the lesson Athens needs to teach itself. That order was restored. That hierarchy held. That disruption was external, not internal. Her story exposes a deeper truth. Female power was not destroyed because it failed. It was removed because it functioned too well. Antiope did not threaten Athens by opposing it alone. She threatened it by demonstrating that authority could be exercised without conforming to its rules. In every version, Antiope is eliminated not for what she did but for what she proved. The war ends. The city moves on. The silence around her grows. That silence is not absence. It is design. The legacy of the Attic War did not preserve Antiope. It absorbed her. What endured was Amazonamaki, a visual and ideological program repeated across Athens in stone paint and ritual. Temple friezes showed mounted women falling beneath Greek spears. Vases depicted chaos subdued by order inversion corrected by force. The Amazons became a category, not a polity. Antiope vanished into the mass. This transformation was not accidental. As Athens expanded its influence, Amazonamaki evolved into metaphor. The foreign woman warrior became a stand-in for the eastern threat yet to come. When Persian armies later crossed into Greece, the imagery was already prepared. Athens had rehearsed the narrative civilization defending itself against an alien order that reversed nature. The Amazons taught the city how to remember invasion without acknowledging internal fracture. Archaeology complicates this memory. Burials identified as Amazon, women interred with weapons, horses, and battle injuries, appear across the Greek world from Attica to the Black Sea. These graves do not belong to myth. They belong to combatants. They confirm that female military power was not imaginary, nor singular. It was present, organized, and recurring. What archaeology restores, narrative suppresses. Antiope's disappearance from history was not due to lack of evidence. It was due to narrative displacement. Her story conflicted with the logic Athens needed to export that order as male, that power follows lineage, that deviation must arrive from outside and be defeated cleanly. Amazonamaki allowed Athens to remember war without remembering compromise. Antiope represented compromise embodied. She could not be carried forward into art or pedagogy without destabilizing the lesson. So she was fragmented, renamed, or omitted. What remains is a chain of transmission shaped by selection. Myth replaces polity. Symbol replaces woman. The Amazon becomes a cautionary figure rather than a historical actor. Antiope becomes a footnote or disappears entirely. Yet the outline of her life resists erasure. She did not ask permission to rule. She did not seek legitimacy through male inheritance. She crossed systems, exercised command, and made decisions under pressure. When forced to choose, she acted knowing the cost. Antiope was not erased because she failed. She was erased because she revealed that power could be built, trained, and sustained outside the structures Athens claimed were natural. That knowledge threatened more than any army. History often remembers conquest and forgets competence. Antiope's story challenges that habit. It asks whether betrayal is defined by loyalty to people or loyalty to systems designed to exclude. It asks whether survival within power is possible without surrendering agency. Athens answered by silence. The question remains, was Antiope a traitor to her people, or a casualty of the order that could not allow her to exist? The Attic War ended, but its structure did not dissolve. It hardened into memory, then into doctrine. Amazonamaki became a civic language through which Athens explained itself, first to its own citizens, later to the wider Greek world. The narrative traveled easily because it was simple. Order had been threatened. Order had prevailed. The names of those who complicated that story were unnecessary. Antiope did not survive this transmission. What survived was a silhouette. A mounted woman falling. A queen reduced to type. Her competence, her decisions, her refusal to vanish quietly. These details obstructed the lesson. They implied that power was not the property of one gender or one system, but the result of training, cohesion, and will. Athens could not carry that implication forward without undermining its own foundations. So Antiope was replaced. By Hippolyta in one version. By Orithyia in another. By no name at all in most. The war remained. The woman at its center dissolved. This pattern is not unique. It is structural. Histories that survive are those that reinforce the legitimacy of those who tell them. Figures who demonstrate alternative competence are not debated. They are edited out. Silence becomes the final instrument of power. Yet the record never disappears completely. Archaeology intrudes. Female skeletons, buried with weapons and war injuries, disrupt the mythic boundary. They confirm that women did fight, did command, did die in organized conflict. Antiope was not an anomaly. She was part of a continuum deliberately severed from narrative memory. Antiope was permitted to exist only as long as she did not force resolution. Once she acted decisively. Once she chose, fought, and held ground. She became intolerable. Both systems required her removal to restore coherence. This is not a story about betrayal in the moral sense. It is a story about systems defending themselves. Antiope betrayed nothing abstract. She honored obligation as she understood it, then accepted the cost when obligation collided. Her death resolved conflict not because she was wrong, but because she was effective. Power that works is more dangerous than power that fails. Athens remembered the war as victory. The Amazons remembered it as correction. Both remembered what they needed. What neither preserved was the figure who revealed the limits of their rules. Antiope did not ask permission to exist within power. She did not wait to be sanctioned by lineage or myth. She acted, and by acting exposed the contingency of every order around her. The question history leaves unresolved is not whether she was traitor or victim. It is whether systems that require erasure to survive deserve the permanence they claim. Antiope disappeared from the record. The structure that erased her remains, and it still decides who is allowed to be remembered. Antiope's story does not end with judgment. It ends with exposure. The Attic War reveals how memory is engineered, not inherited. What Athens preserved was not accuracy, but utility. Amazonamaki endured because it could be reused. Against Persia, against foreignness, against any threat framed as inversion. Antiope could not be reused. She was too specific, too competent, too disruptive. Legacy, in this sense, is not a record of what happened. It is a filter applied afterward. Antiope passed through that filter and did not survive intact. Her name fragmented, her role blurred. Her actions were reassigned to safer figures or dissolved into collective myth. What remained was a warning without a subject, yet traces persist. Archaeological finds across Greece and the Black Sea, female burials with weapons, horses, and combat trauma, confirm that Antiope's world was not fiction. Women commanded. Women fought. Women died in organized warfare. These were not symbols carved after the fact. They were participants removed from narrative convenience. The gap between material evidence and cultural memory is not accidental. It marks a choice. Remembering Antiope as she was would have required Athens to admit that power is not guaranteed by gender lineage or ideology. It would have required acknowledgement that competence can emerge outside sanctioned structures and function. That admission was intolerable. So Antiope becomes a question rather than a figure. Was she a traitor to her people for leaving, or a casualty of a system that allowed no exit? Was she loyal to Athens, or merely useful until stability returned? Each answer reveals more about the system answering than about Antiope herself. What is clear is this: Antiope did not fail. She trained. She ruled. She chose. She fought. She died in consequence of those choices. Erasure followed not because her story lacked importance, but because it possessed too much of it. History often presents itself as accumulation. In reality, it is subtraction. Figures who complicate legitimacy are removed. Their absence becomes normal. Over time, silence reads as inevitability. Antiope's absence is not inevitable. It is instructive. Her life demonstrates that power is built, not bestowed. That systems endure by excluding what they cannot absorb. That memory is an extension of authority, not a neutral archive. She did not ask permission to exist within power. She simply refused to disappear quietly. The question remains open, not for Athens, but for those who inherit its stories. When a woman crosses systems, acts decisively, and exposes the limits of order, do we call her traitor? Or do we recognize the cost systems demand to preserve themselves? Antiope's gone. What erased her is still with us, and it still decides whose competence becomes history and whose becomes silence.